All right, so this is chapter 2 of our book. My friend and I wrote 30 short stories, and they're all based in the same county, which is the title of the book, Ekeland County. And this is chapter 2. This gives you some idea of what's happening in this town, in this county. It's called Pudge's Raid. Officer Percival Pudge Gooseman cast an imposing figure in the corner of the cafeteria, standing with his arms crossed over his slight paunch. He didn't mean to be imposing, but he was required to wear a gun and a uniform whenever he reported for his job as school resource officer. His steel eyes, distorted behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, scanned the usual 11:26 lunch crowd, watching for problems. When something arose, he moved quickly. "Wait, Estrellita," he said quietly, placing his hand on the young girl's shoulders as he knelt. He took the milk carton from her small, white-palmed hands and pried the spout open, delicately tearing a piece of loose cardboard from the point so she wouldn't have to drink it. "Gracias," she inhaled the syllables. He smiled at her. "De nada." Pudge thought he saw some color come to her cheeks as he stood and walked back to his corner. The 1140s were coming in, and a group of boys, Juan, Jose, and Jose, were speed-walking down the hall in accordance with the spirit of the law. Pudge patted the air with a downward-facing palm. "Despacio." The boys' teeth shimmered against the contrast of their skin, and they chimed greetings in their own language. They were good boys, if a little mischievous, and lunch was always a good time to make a few more connections. "Juan," he called out, "juegaste football?" Juan nodded, grinning. "Metiste un gol?" Juan nodded again and smiled completely. "Dos." Pudge leaned against the wall, scanning the middle schoolers as they ate. There were some on the force who were uncomfortable with the new population in the county, but Pudge saw these kids as he did any others. Perhaps that was why he was appointed resource officer. Pudge rose from his kitchen table, walking into his living room as his wife began clearing the dishes. "Donald, you have homework, Mrs. Morgan told me." Donald dropped his little sister's doll into her pleading hands and slouched over to where his book bag lay. Sarah swooned over the doll and began cooing to it, comforting it after its hostage experience. Pudge took the day's paper and settled into his recliner. The leather chair embraced him like a familiar lover. He could smell the coffee brewing in the one-cup coffee maker he had left in the kitchen, and he sighed deeply. Pudge rattled his paper as he opened it to page 3. His eyes drifted across the titles of the letters to the editor, and he paused to glance at the names after some of the comments. He smiled at the familiarity of the names and was relieved to see that none of his co-workers had written. He turned the page as he felt a buzz on his left hip. The screen on his beeper commanded him to call the station. "Officer Gooseman," he said when he called the dispatch desk. "About 10 minutes. "Okay, I'll see you then." "What's going on, dear?" asked his wife. "Can't really say," Pudge replied, frowning, "but it looks like I have to work tonight." The 3 black vans, escorted by 3 police cars, approached Parapet Apartments. There were no lights used, but the arrival of the police was always publicized. The officers were out of the van and into 3 separate buildings quickly, per training. All in black, the men were armored with bulletproof vests, riot helmets, and gas masks. 2 knocks, 5 seconds, and the aluminum doors came down with a ram. The officers in the cars fanned out behind the buildings to catch jumpers. A steep hill in the back of the building made an emergency exit, even from a 3rd-story window, painless. With a flick of a hand and a collective grunt, the domestic soldiers were on the roll. They moved quickly, tramping in unison up the steps. 1 knock, 2 knocks, and the battering ram dented in and sprung the metal door. The orders were clear, and they were certain of which apartments they invaded. There were no mix-ups like the raid in Bordeaux the year before. They were going to take out a well-known drug kingpin. Though a rural county, Ekeland had become recognized as one of the marijuana and methamphetamine capitals of the East. Gang graffiti had been ignored as a nuisance for almost a year until a nearly decapitated body was found and connected to gang activity in Northern Virginia. The subsequent informational sessions for the police force, given by a former investigator from Los Angeles, opened their eyes and their minds, and they were facing something bigger and more destructive than they had imagined. The officers recognized far too many tattoos and graffiti tags in the slideshows, and left that session ill at ease with the communities they served. They headed out on their patrols half-informed and more dangerous than before. The police descended from the first apartment, their target apprehended. The second group was in the next building, heading to 2B. Brown women hugged crying children to their breasts as the men in black burst into their homes. "Down on the floor, get down!" The excited hand gestures did nothing to improve communication with hysterical women. Phones throughout the 7 separate buildings began to ring, and by the time the officers were entering the 3rd building, audiences of tiny brown eyes peeked out from the doorways cracked on darkness. Standard procedure was followed, and the door came down, and the police entered, securing room by room. Pudge's ride helmet was beginning to create its own rain from the fog of his breath and the heat of his exertion. He was the second officer into the tiny bedroom, and shouting as he entered, "Down, on the floor!" The dark brown eyes of Estrellita stared at him from the shivering mound on the bed. He raised his shotgun, balancing it vertically with one arm, and reached out to her. She screamed and retreated, and Pudge's companion jerked her and the covers and what appeared to be a little brother from the pile on the bed. There was a thud as they hit the floor, and suddenly there was a sound like firecrackers in the other room. His partner dove from in front of the open doorway, and Pudge dropped over the kids like an ill-fitting carp. He shushed them while they struggled under his weight. The boy struggled. Estrellita just stared at him through the sweat-smeared visor of his ride helmet. The next day, all classes were overwhelmingly populated by white faces. This continued for 2 or 3 days before the reintegration began. On the 4th day after the raid, Pudge returned to school. Standing in the hallway, he watched as the children got off the bus and walked by him on their way to the cafeteria for breakfast. He tried to give each child a good morning, or a hi, or a buenos dias, but he was watching for one child specifically. When bus 74 arrived, Pudge leaned forward from the wall. 3 white faces bounded off the bus, and then a darker little boy, Gustavo, Estrellita's little brother, and then Estrellita. She walked like a mouse in a lion's cage, glancing to both sides and quivering a bit with the urge to bolt towards the bushes. When she got to the door, she paused before yanking on the brass handle. She was 3 steps inside when she saw Pudge. Estrellita's eyes grew huge and wet, and her jaw began to shake. He saw her look at his gun, his badge, his nightstick, and then back at his gun. "Estrellita," he whispered. She glanced up, only briefly flitting her eyes across his face as the shadow of a bird passes over a puddle of moonlight. "Buenos dias." Her eyes dropped after he spoke, and she hurried by.